Sarawak's chief minister just dropped a bombshell that should make every Malaysian sit up and pay attention. In a move that stunned political observers, he declared that Borneo's economic future will be decided in Kuching and Kota Kinabalu, not Kuala Lumpur. This isn't just political rhetoric. This is the beginning of something that could reshape Malaysia as we know it. If you're listening right now, I need your help with something. My friend from KL told me Malaysians don't care about what happens in East Malaysia, that nobody would watch a video like this. But I think he's wrong. I think we're all curious about where our country is heading. Help me prove that Malaysians actually want to understand what's happening in Sabah and Sarawak. Hit that subscribe button and show him we're paying attention. Assalamu alaikum and welcome. What you're about to hear isn't just another political story. It's about a fundamental shift in power that's been building for decades, and it's finally reaching a tipping point. Let me take you back to 1963. When Malaya, Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore came together to form Malaysia, it wasn't supposed to be a takeover. It was meant to be a partnership of equals. The Malaysia Agreement clearly outlined this. Sarawak and Sabah weren't joining as states beneath Malaya. They were founding partners with specific rights and autonomy. But somewhere along the way, that narrative changed. Somewhere in the decades that followed, Borneo became the forgotten half of Malaysia. Here's what most Malaysians don't realize. Sarawak is massive. At 124,000 square kilometers, it's larger than the entire peninsular Malaysia minus Pahang. It holds some of the richest natural resources in Southeast Asia. Oil, gas, timber, palm oil, hydroelectric potential that could power half the region. Yet for decades, Sarawakians watched their wealth flow westward while their roads remained unpaved and their rural communities went without electricity. But here's where it gets interesting. Follow the money. In 2022, Sarawak contributed over 20 billion ringgit to federal coffers through petroleum revenues alone. That's not counting other resources. Yet the state's development allocation from Putrajaya? A fraction of that. Roads in rural Sarawak that take 6 hours to travel 100 kilometers. Long houses still using generators because the national grid hasn't reached them. Schools where teachers have to take boats to get to class. Sound familiar if you've ever been to the interior? My cousin teaches in Kapit. She tells me stories that sound like they're from another century, not another state in modern Malaysia. Now, here's what changed everything. In 2022, Sarawak did something unprecedented. They asserted their rights under the Malaysia Agreement and started taking back control. Not through confrontation, but through legal frameworks that had been there all along, just never enforced. The Sarawak state government began requiring companies operating in their territory to route certain transactions through local banks, pay certain fees directly to state coffers, and comply with state regulations that had teeth. Premier Abang Johari didn't just complain about unfair treatment. He built an alternative. The Post-COVID Development Strategy 2030 isn't just a plan. It's a declaration of economic independence. Digital economy hubs in Kuching. A hydrogen economy leveraging Sarawak's hydroelectric capacity. Direct foreign investment attracted to Sarawak, bypassing Kuala Lumpur entirely. Think about what this means for a second. Singapore became what it is by controlling its own destiny. Sarawak has 10 times Singapore's land area, vast natural resources, and a strategic position in the heart of Southeast Asia. The state government looked at that equation and asked a simple question. Why do we need Kuala Lumpur's permission to prosper? Let me give you a specific example that shows how dramatic this shift is. Sarawak Energy Berhad, the state-owned power company, doesn't just generate electricity for Sarawak anymore. They're negotiating directly with Singapore and Indonesia to export clean energy. Not through Petronas, not through federal channels. Direct state-to-state, state-to-nation deals. That's the kind of move that makes federal officials nervous. And oil and gas. This is where it gets really interesting. For decades, Petronas controlled everything. The federal government took the lion's share of petroleum revenues under agreements made when Sarawak had little negotiating power. But Sarawak's legal team went back to the original Malaysia Agreement and found something crucial. The agreement gave states rights over natural resources that had been systematically ignored. In 2019, Sarawak passed the Oil Mining Ordinance, asserting state authority over oil and gas in state waters. Putrajaya fought it. Legal battles ensued. But Sarawak held firm, and slowly, the balance of power shifted. Today, Sarawak negotiates petroleum revenue sharing from a position of strength, not as a supplicant. The numbers tell the story. Sarawak's state revenue has grown from 6.5 billion ringgit in 2017 to over 12 billion in 2023. That's not just inflation. That's a state taking control of its economic destiny. The state budget now funds massive infrastructure projects without waiting for federal approval. The Pan-Borneo Highway, once a federal project moving at glacial pace, suddenly accelerated when state funds started flowing. But wait until you hear what happened next. Other states started watching. Sabah looked at what Sarawak was doing and thought, why not us? Kelantan, Terengganu, states with oil wealth and decades of frustration, they're watching too. Sarawak didn't just change its own trajectory, it created a template. Here's something most people miss about this whole situation. This isn't about Sarawak leaving Malaysia. That's not what anyone serious is proposing. This is about restructuring the relationship to match what was originally promised in 1963. It's about federalism actually working the way it's supposed to work, with states having real power and real autonomy. Think of it like this. You and your friend start a business together as equal partners. But over the years, your friend starts making all the decisions, taking most of the profits, telling you to be grateful for whatever you get. Eventually, you pull out the original partnership agreement and say, remember this? We're equal partners. Let's act like it. That's essentially what's happening here. The political establishment in Kuala Lumpur is slowly realizing they can't ignore this anymore. Sarawak holds crucial parliamentary seats. In a closely divided parliament, Sarawak's bloc isn't just important, it's decisive. And Sarawakian politicians know it. They've gone from being quiet backbenchers to kingmakers who negotiate from strength. Premier Abang Johari isn't subtle about this either. He speaks openly about Sarawak's rights, about the Malaysia Agreement, about autonomy. He visits foreign countries and signs economic agreements like he's running a semi-independent state. Because in many ways, that's increasingly what Sarawak is becoming. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like on the ground. Kuching's waterfront looks more like Singapore every year. New high-rises, international hotels, modern infrastructure. Rural areas that were forgotten for decades are finally getting roads, electricity, internet. Not because Putrajaya suddenly became generous, but because Sarawak is funding it themselves. Young Sarawakians who used to automatically move to KL for opportunities? Many are staying now, or even moving back. There's a palpable sense that something is changing. That opportunity exists at home. Tech startups in Kuching. Manufacturing facilities attracted by competitive incentives the state can now offer. A new airport terminal handling direct international flights. And here's the thing nobody wants to say out loud, but everyone's thinking. If Sarawak can do this, if Borneo's states can chart their own economic course, what does that mean for the concept of Malaysia itself? Not in terms of breaking apart, but in terms of how power is distributed, how resources are shared, how decisions are made. The federal government faces a dilemma. Push back too hard, and you risk alienating regions that are already feeling historically marginalized. Give in too much, and you set a precedent that every state with resources will follow. It's a delicate balance, and right now Sarawak is calling the shots. Remember what I said earlier about this being a template? Watch Sabah. They're not as far along as Sarawak, but they're asking the same questions. They're looking at their palm oil, their tourism potential, their strategic position, and wondering why they're still among the poorest states in Malaysia when they should be among the richest. There's a broader lesson here about development and autonomy. For decades, the model was centralized control. Everything flows through Putrajaya. Every major decision needs federal approval. Every ringgit comes with strings attached. That model worked when Malaysia was young and needed unity. But 60 years later, it's becoming a straitjacket. Sarawak is proving that there's another way. Local control doesn't mean chaos or fragmentation. It can mean faster decisions, better tailored policies, and development that actually matches local needs. When you don't have to wait for a federal bureaucrat in KL who's never been to your state to approve your projects, things move faster. The Malaysia Agreement of 1963 guaranteed Sarawak and Sabah control over immigration, even from other Malaysian states. That's why you need to show your IC when you fly to Kuching or KK. It guaranteed autonomy in certain areas. These weren't just symbolic gestures. They were recognition that one-size-fits-all governance doesn't work in a country as diverse as Malaysia. What's happening now is those guarantees are finally being taken seriously after decades of erosion. And it's not just about money or resources. It's about dignity. It's about Sarawakians and Sabahans looking at their own states and feeling like they're in control of their future, not dependent on faraway decisions made by people who may never visit. Here's the big picture that everyone needs to understand. Malaysia is at a crossroads. The old centralized model is cracking. States are asserting themselves. Resources and power are being redistributed, sometimes peacefully through negotiation, sometimes through tension and legal battle. Sarawak's boldness is forcing a national conversation we should have had decades ago. What kind of federation do we want to be? How do we balance unity with diversity? How do we ensure that every part of Malaysia can prosper without waiting for permission from the center? These aren't easy questions. There are legitimate concerns about fragmentation, about ensuring poorer states aren't left behind, about maintaining national cohesion. But ignoring these questions doesn't make them go away. Sarawak is proving that. The most fascinating aspect of this whole situation is what it says about power in Malaysia. For so long, power flowed in one direction. From the states to the federal government, from the regions to Kuala Lumpur. Now we're seeing it flow back. Not through revolution or conflict, but through legal frameworks, economic leverage, and political negotiation. Borneo's future no longer depends on Kuala Lumpur because Borneo is building its own future. With its own resources, its own plans, its own negotiations with the world. That doesn't make them less Malaysian. It makes Malaysia more federal, more balanced, more like what it was supposed to be from the beginning. So when Sarawak's leader makes that shocking declaration, he's not being provocative. He's being honest. He's acknowledging a reality that's been building for years and is now impossible to ignore. The question isn't whether Borneo will chart its own course. They're already doing it. The question is whether the rest of Malaysia will adapt to this new reality or cling to an old model that's already fading. Hit that like button if this opened your eyes to what's really happening in our country. Subscribe, because these are the stories that shape Malaysia's future, and someone needs to tell them. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think Sarawak's approach is the way forward, or does Malaysia need stronger central control? I'm curious what you think. This conversation is just beginning, and we all need to be part of it.